So, I'll hop right to it since we're already a little bit behind. I'm not the best player of the kind of slated hosts of the evolution chamber. My expertise lies in an understanding of cognitive science. That's how the mind works. So the edges that I'll look to bring to you today will be most closely related to thinking about human cognition and how we can think more intelligently about approaching improvement to make the time we spend towards StarCraft more efficient, effective, and enjoyable. So it's titled Ladder Mastery, Accelerating Improvement by Enhancing the Quality of Practice. Use the ladder as a tool, and do not be used by the ladder or blinded by it. A lot of players see ladder and rank as the end-all, the final thing that people seek to achieve. They have their eyes fixed on that next promotion, and that seems to be the most important objective. So anytime they dip away from that, there's a sort of trouble and crisis where there doesn't need to be. It's more useful to think of hitting the ladder button like hitting the gym. When you hit the gym, you're not going to set your new personal best every single time. It's just about exercising and tearing down your muscles a little bit so that they can be built back up again. Similarly, ladder games, you enter into a match against an opponent who's trying to tear you down, set you off balance, knock you off your plan. You lose lots of games, you lose some points. You win some games, you win some points. But over the long term, you're going to get much, much stronger. So, as a baseline to understanding improvement, the first thing we check in with is our humanity. A given player is a human being with a physical body and an organic brain. We are not perfectly consistent in our health, mood, and performance. We require nourishment, rest, and stimulation to thrive. If the machinery of the body is not maintained, the performance of the brain and skill in games will suffer. Take care of your body. So, whenever you're getting into your games, you want to be very aware of how well your body is running, because that's going to directly relate to how well you play. Think about finding your optimal sleeping hours. For most people, it's around 8. It can be a little bit more or less. But getting a full night of sleep will make your matches a lot better. You'll be able to think more clearly. You'll be able to think more creatively. Memory works better when you're well rested. So really emphasizing a baseline of a good night's sleep before you put in practice. Another point, improving your diet. So the brain consumes 20% of your daily calorie intake. I'll actually put that in the notes. It's a very expensive organ to run. The brain is the computer of the body. Just as your computer requires power from the outlet in the wall, our brains require power from the food that we consume. So when you wake up in the morning, you haven't eaten overnight for most people. So you need to put some more fuel in that tank, because you have to spend fuel to think about StarCraft, to move your hands and play the game. Hydration. Hydration is really crucial for effective performance. Water is life. Water is what lubricates everything that's going on in our systems. We are mostly water. So a really good habit to get into is having a goblet of water of some kind that's always at your desk that you can drink from at any moment. There's a lot of advertisement for a lot of sugary energy drinks, which can be fun, but they're really not the best for our body. Water should be the base, where you drink water whenever you're thirsty. If you want a tasty recreational beverage, by all means, go enjoy that, but exercise some moderation. Water is really the core of your intake over the course of the day. And then exercise. Exercise is something that people can be very gung-ho about. It can be a big part of your life, or it can be a fairly small part of your life, but having a little bit goes a really long way. So when you're waking up in the morning, maybe you've had your work day, whatever. If you're getting into your ladder games, it really, really helps if you just exercise the body a little bit. Maybe you jump up and down 10 times. Maybe you run around the block. Maybe you do yoga for about 20 minutes. It doesn't need to be a big thing, but just kind of waking up the body and really addressing more of yourself will make you feel more alert and really improve your blood flow when you're sitting in your chair. It's a little bit kind of counter to expectations. StarCraft is incredibly intensive on the mind, but we sit in a chair as though we were watching a television show or a movie, but our mind is very, very active and we're tracking things all over the screen trying to make really fast decisions. So we're in a very hyper-aroused state, but we're sitting on our butts. We're not actually like running and hunting, but we're using a lot of those same like snap decisions and skills, where you have potential threats, you have potential allies and tools you can use, and you're trying to make a series of mental calculations really quickly to solve problems effectively. And having the body in good condition and very awake, alert, and alive is really core to being successful on that front. Moving on to cognition. A human is a thinking entity motivated by beliefs, desires, and ambitions. Wisdom entails careful consideration of thought and seeks to understand the reasons for our motivations. Be a wise steward of your mind. Think about the purpose that you play a game. You could play it for recreation because it's fun. You could play it because you like socializing with your friends and they also play that game. For a game like StarCraft, people don't play it because it's relaxing and easy. They play it because it's hard, it's very intensive, it's brutal, and it's very competitive. And that's an excellent exercise. Kind of the same reason that people do ultra marathons, crazy things like that, where you're really pushing the body, or in the case of StarCraft, the mind and the hands to their limit. That's a really cool thing. And considering your purpose for playing the game and putting that in front of you will make it easier to take losses, because you understand that losing games is part of the process of playing the game. And if you're playing the game and losing, you can still enjoy aspects of the game, even if you don't achieve the victory condition. Benefits of competitive gaming. This is something that not that many people in the online gaming community know, but there are actually measurable benefits to strategy gaming, action gaming. StarCraft seems to be one of the best forms of mental exercise. There are very clear improvements to our ability to context switch. So whenever you're playing StarCraft, you have a lot of things going on, and you have to direct your attention to the most important thing at a given time, make some adjustments, and then change your attention based on what your opponent does to you. These skills, like that process of thinking, applies to the real world as well. A really fantastic kind of example would be, say you're in a really tough traffic situation, like managing your motor vehicle, and then suddenly something comes into your field of view. If you have lots of practice in a strategy game, for example, it'll be much easier for you to kind of trust your instincts, make the adjustment in a calm and deliberate way, and really succeed with those snap decisions in an accurate fashion. StarCraft is all about speed and accuracy and kind of the precision of your decision making. So you can think about it as a way of training your brain. It's not just playing StarCraft because it's fun and awesome and it's amazing when banelings blow up. It's really good mental exercise, which scales well into late adulthood. As people are aging, people retire from work, and often a lot of their cognitive faculties decline, especially in their 60s and 70s, which has onset of Alzheimer's, dementia, and all kinds of other really nasty things that cause the brain to decay. But if you have really great mental exercise, those progressions of your brain decaying are slowed down. It doesn't stop everything entirely, but it does keep your brain fit for much longer. And then goals, thinking about the goals of your career. You could have a goal of maybe a certain league. Say you want to be Diamond or Masters at some point in your career. That's a totally valid goal, and understanding that that's a long-term goal will make your improvement more relaxed in the immediate term. You want to think about your daily path. Every time you sit down to play, you have the opportunity to take a few steps toward the goal, but you won't necessarily reach the goal. It seems to be better to see the goal as something that will excite you and surprise you when you get there, rather than something that you try and claw for every single time you play. So say you want to get that Diamond League, but you're in Gold. Think about this map. Think about this opponent that you're faced with in this game, and do your best, like hit your gas timing, try and do your build correctly, hit your scout timing. Really focus on the fundamentals, and let the goal be as it is, kind of off in the distance, and you'll definitely get there if you keep to the path. Time management. So this has to do with organization of your time in StarCraft. Not everyone can spend equal time playing the game, so think about the time you can devote to StarCraft, and think about how to structure that in a way that will be very pertinent to progress. It's pretty easy to kind of just log in, maybe play some team games, maybe do some ladder games, but taking time to think slowly about the game will really accelerate your progress. So say when you log in, maybe you do a drill, like an inject drill, or maybe you just open an empty custom game and you just practice your build. That'll make your ladder games much, much better because you've already sort of rehearsed your basic timings before you're getting beaten around and harassed by the opponent. So that's going to improve the quality of your ladder games, and then throughout your ladder games, as we'll talk later, really paying close attention to the score screen. Like I'll just bring up one now in the match history. So you have the score screen. It gives you tons of data, and before you dive into another match, it's really, really useful to just like check over the build. What was this build? 3 barracks. There were tons of Reapers in my base. It was 3 barracks though. Quantify what's happening before you move on to the next game. You can inform your game knowledge every match, but the amount of game knowledge you gain depends on how much you kind of look for. If I just spam the ladder button again before looking at this build order, I might not know whether it was 2 barracks, 3 barracks, or 4 barracks, or 5 barracks. And then the graphs. The graphs give you a lot. We'll get to this later. But really expanding the time you spend to StarCraft beyond just hitting the play button to some review, kind of looking at the math of StarCraft. There's a lot of really juicy and amazing mathematics in the game that as you kind of appreciate the numbers involved, your decision making will become much more precise. One of the major differences across the leagues is just having a keen awareness of how economies grow in StarCraft and how to spend those economies. Moving on to emotion. The brain responds to circumstances with thought and emotion. Be mindful of your feelings as they manifest, and find productive modes of expression. There's the stereotype of the raging gamer. You see it all over the place. It's kind of rare that you'll have someone who keeps their shit together. So, taking emotion as it is, as humans. We experience it. It sucks to lose. It doesn't feel good. It sucks to die to cheese. It doesn't feel good to be bad-mannered by the opponent. But all those circumstances happen when you're on the ladder. So, improving upon the ability with which you deal with your emotion will really enhance and improve your gaming experience and just make you a happier person in general. So the first step is identifying the different emotional types that you can experience. Anger, frustration, anxiety, ladder anxiety, entitlement, feeling like a person deserves something. There's a lot of entitlement related to the portrait borders in the game, so a player of higher league, when they're queued against a player of lower league, often feels like I deserve to win because I have the shinier border, which is not necessarily true. Every match is a clean slate. It's a new opportunity to outplay your opponent. The portrait borders are mainly an average of how well they've performed over the season, rather than a true prediction of how they're going to play this game. Demoralisation. This kind of pertains to the sense of losing motivation to move forward by maybe a losing streak, maybe you feel like you're stagnating in your improvement. These emotions can often help us point to what we need to improve in our own mentality. Rather than say, no, you shouldn't experience emotion, the main goal is to identify the emotion and then have a plan for dealing with that. So another tool is rating the intensity of an emotion that you experience. So say you log in, you're going to play some ladder games, but you had kind of a shit day, so you're not in the best mood. Say you're like level 2 angry. You log in and you get adept all in, and it wrecks you, and it feels icky, like they killed all your workers, you couldn't build the army that you wanted to, You hit your timings correctly, but you forgot to scout, and you get bumped up to a 4 anger. Being able to notice your anger as it's rising will help you manage it more effectively. It's easier to deal with level 4 anger than it is like keyboard smashing level 10 anger. So notice that as it's rising slowly and kind of make peace with it each time. So if a dirty cheese happens to you and you get kind of mad, go to the worker's active graph, inject some logic, say, all right, that was really an effective build and I don't feel good about how that match went. What could I have done differently? Quantify what's going on. How many gateways were in that adept all-in? How many probes did the Protoss make? If you have more numbers in your mind, it kind of pushes out some of that raw anger emotion, and you can focus more on the path and focus more on improvement. Another step is identifying emotion-inducing situations. This is unique for everyone, so people generally don't like losing, but there are some variations. Like, I've heard from some people that when they play against big streamers, they take the losses a lot harder because they feel like they're being watched. For me personally, if I play a big viewership streamer, I get a little bit more nervous than if I'm just playing someone who doesn't stream, because I know that there are more eyes on it, there's more kind of drama involved, and I've tried to take some time away from the game to kind of make peace with that and say, yep, this is inevitably going to happen, I'm going to face more streamers, and I'm going to try and remain calm and do the best I can, because rather than try and get the victory in the immediate term and really impress everybody, think about putting on a good show and having a really good time. And then the fourth step would be management plans. So understanding critical thresholds for your emotion, like the example given here is when you're at an 8+ of anger, like you're really mad, go outside, go for a run, go do some pull-ups, like really get that out of your body physically in a way that's productive and constructive. The outbursts toward friends and family often happen when that anger sneaks up upon you, and then you don't realize where it came from, and you dump it onto someone or something. So notice it as it's rising. Your anger or frustration are building up, and you say, all right, whenever I get really mad, I'm going to go hit the gym and make some gains and get buff. Like, that's fantastic. Anger is something that you can't really just shut off. You can't say, oh, I'm just going to not be angry. It doesn't work that way. You need to let it flow out freely in a way that's constructive and productive. So you have to be responsible with the emotion that you experience. Improvement. Through study, practice, and review, the brain changes its connections to solve problems more accurately and efficiently. The rate of improvement increases as the quality and quantity of experience increases. So, study material. There's so much in the StarCraft community. People are very good about sharing study material between each other. Team Liquid is a fantastic community where they have forums, they're constantly posting builds, guides, replay packs, all kinds of stuff. Streams have an abundance of information. A lot of streamers are very engaging. They'll answer questions, they'll kind of explain what they're doing. VODs of major events you can kind of study and think about what players went for on certain maps and why it's strong. Replays are a complete picture of what happened in a given match that you can open up yourself in the game client. I would definitely encourage more replay analysis than looking at VODs, because it'll allow you to pause and kind of look around at everything that's happening at a given state from both players' perspectives. So we'll get into some games a little bit later and kind of think about human attention and how that pertains to skill within the game. And it's an element that's slightly missed in a lot of the tournament showings. So the caster will often be following an observer who's kind of following the action around the map, but you don't get to see very much of the two players' points of view. And a big part of dealing big damage to the opponent at a high level is causing one player to focus their attention up here while you strike them down here. So paying attention to how attention works is really cool in replays. And then another form would be coaching. Getting coaching is one of the fastest ways to improve, mainly because a coach who is levels above you, sometimes even below you, can look at your play and from a very neutral third-party perspective just see what's going wrong. When you're looking at your own replays, you kind of understand what you meant to do, and you know kind of what your plan was intended to look like, and you kind of bear all things in the context of your emotion, how your day was going, how your session was going so far, and it's really easy to make excuses for yourself when good coaches won't really let you do that, and the mistakes will just be as they are, and they can give you a very tangible list of things to work on. A lot of people, they'll just be laddering constantly, but they won't have a very tangible directive for how do I improve today? What are my main leaks? What are my main mistakes? Coaches are really good for just pointing to that, or maybe teaching you a style that's more optimized and fitting for you. Practice volume. So StarCraft is incredibly stressful, very, very stressful. People who are new to the game, usually playing like 1 to 3 matches, and they feel, oh, I'm exhausted. Like, I was trying to do so much, and it was really hard to keep up mechanically. My opponent built their base in my base. There was like a cannon shooting me. Like, I don't understand what's going on. This game is very hard. I was there. I was in Bronze League. Like, it's very scary. So, thinking about it like distance running with your practice volume. A marathon runner didn't start running a marathon the first time they went outside. You run a mile or a couple kilometers, and then you gradually build up from that. So when you're starting out in your ladder experience, doing 1 to 2 games is totally legit and totally valid. Over the course of your training, maybe just adding on a game or 2. So don't set super hard hours for yourself of I need to practice from this time to this time. Use your body and how you're feeling as a guide, and kind of be flexible with how you're feeling, and also be willing to increase your volume as you have the time to do so. Training regimen. So this is kind of what was mentioned earlier about expanding your practice beyond just ladder games. Finding some useful drills for yourself, maybe a creep spread drill if you're Zerg, inject drill. There are some hotkey trainers that are really good in the game. And then finding partners for custom games are really efficient ways of working on a matchup. If you're just pushing the ladder button, you don't get to control which race you're going to face. It's basically randomly dealt to you. But if you're in a custom game, you've basically asked someone, hey, will you practice with me? We can go on these maps, we'll play some games. And you have more consistency in your training. You can work on the same build every time, or multiple builds if you want to, and really hone in on how that matchup works, what the threats are in that matchup, and it makes it a lot more easy to narrow down the range of what you're learning. Ladder matches, we kind of talked about that already. So the ladder is an open probability space where there's a lot that just gets dealt. The map is dealt, the opponent is dealt, the opponent's build is effectively dealt to you. You don't really decide that, they decide that. So it's kind of fun to put yourself into that environment and be willing to adjust to what you're faced with. And then replay analysis is really fantastic. You probably don't need to go over every replay. Usually going over your losses is more beneficial than going over your wins, but technically you can still find mistakes in your wins as well. And then analysis and leak finding, score screen study and replay analysis. We can probably start to go over this pretty soon in a game. So I'll go over a match, we'll kind of see how the match plays out, and then think about how to think about the score screen and what to look for, and how we can kind of infer what went wrong in the match from the score screen, and then look at the match itself in the replay. So let's go to the match history first. I played a game against Bubbles, who is I think he's retired pro gamer. He's very good. He usually beats me. Okay, we got Bubbles. So this was a defeat for me on Orbital Shipyard. 16-minute match. The default scenario when you exit a game, it has your ladder points up here in the top right. So most people, when they finish a ladder game, they'll look at their ladder points and they'll be like, I lost 20 points or whatever. And that's like the take home, like the main idea of the match, which doesn't help you at all. You think about your path of improvement, the ladder points will just go up and down. Maybe over time they'll trend upward and you move through the leagues. But really, looking at ladder points serves you in almost no way whatsoever. So let's think about what's useful at the score screen. Unspent resources. That's a pretty good stat to look at. For any given game, like say you get maxed out at 200 supply, Sometimes it'll go up really high, but generally it's good to try and lower that. Time supply capped is another pretty useful stat. You can kind of track that over the course of games and see if you ever have any really big values there. Workers created is a pretty interesting statistic because sometimes your workers created will be very, very high because you had to supply your losses. So if you lost a lot of workers and you had to remake those workers, it'll look really high, but that's not necessarily a good thing. Often that'll indicate that you didn't defend your economy very well. Score summary, you can kind of see who gathered more resources. This is a really cool stat. So Bubbles gathered more resources than me. That means he can make more army than me if he spends it correctly. Units tab, he made more units and he killed more units than me. Structures, he built a lot more structures than me. Technology, I had a lot more tech, but apparently it wasn't the correct tech to beat his superior resource and unit count. Units tab, not amazingly useful. Build order is really nice, especially when you lose to cheese or greed. For solid play, it's not the most useful piece, but say it was multi-Rax Reaper, like in the other example. This is a really good way to know exactly how many barracks. For, say, an Adept all-in, usually you'll be able to see the gateways, the number of Adepts that were built, and then there will be another round of gateways if it's a Warp Prism Adept all-in. So for this game, he went Nexus first, gateway, gas, couple Adepts for scouting, Mothership Core for defense, Stalker and Sentry to be safe and to deny scouting. So Bubbles went for a very economical build here into double Stargate. In the replay, we'll look at kind of how this manifested and think a lot about vision. Vision is very important for informing your decision making. Workers active. This is usually what I tell people to look at first when they finish a ladder game. It gives you tons of information about who had the economy lead and for how long. So here, Bubbles has a very small economy lead here, and then we're basically even coming up to this point, up to around 3 base saturation. But then Bubbles saturates his 4th much faster than me. So we'll look in the replay as to why that is. He actually denied my Overlord that was scouting the 4th base location, and I didn't put a Ling there, so he took it much earlier than I was expecting. Often, Protoss players are going for big, huge attacks with like 2 base attack, 3 base attack, 3 base attack, and then they'll take a 4th. But he took a 4th straight away. So I could have droned mine if I knew that he took it. Army value graph. This graph is really useful for thinking about the major engagements, like who made more stuff. A lot of players, when they're in a match, they'll lose a really big fight and they'll be like, oh, Imba, like, this game is not fair. Like, how did you, I made these units and they're supposed to win. Not necessarily. If the opponent just makes a lot more stuff than you, even if the composition isn't quite as good, it can wreck you. So really think about making more stuff than the opponent, and how that's just a way to win in RTS. You make an economy, you produce, and then you fight, basically. So in this game, Bubbles made a better economy, he produced a bigger army. So let's dive into the game and think about why that was the case. Work on some analysis. I'm not teaching a particular Zerg style in this lesson. Mainly it's thinking about how to do some leak finding in your own games and identify where you fell behind and what you could have done better. So Orbital Shipyard, pretty standard normal map. It's not one of the more extreme maps this season. The 3rd base is pretty easy to defend. This 4th base, also pretty easy to defend. This loading screen teaching us a lesson in patience. So we begin. Units tab is pretty nice to follow. For Zerg, looking at your larva, anytime that gets really high, that'll indicate maybe you should be spending that more quickly. I think of larva for Zerg as being spent into drones, really as fast as possible, until you're ready to make units for a deliberate purpose, either to hit at timing, to scout, to build an overload for supply, Otherwise, it should be just drones as fast as possible. It's kind of like your gas pedal of power. So, Bubbles queued as random, and he said, "Good luck, have fun, I'm Protoss." That's nice of him, but some opponents will lie to you on the ladder when they queue as random. Bubbles doesn't really do that. Winter doesn't really do that, but some people do that. So, I tend to kind of be open to the possibility that there's a 12 pool coming or multi-Rax Reaper, even if they say it's Protoss, so you'll be less surprised. Surprise is a really big edge for players in a strategy game, and if they queue as random and they tell you that they're the wrong race, they can give you a really big surprise. So we've confirmed with the first Overlord that it's Protoss. I made 8 to defend these first 2 Adepts. If it's Stalkers, the 8 could also kill those. So at this stage of the game, things are going pretty much according to plan. I see that 2 more units are being made from these gateways. Spreading some creep, connecting the bases. All good stuff. Queen is zoning out the Adepts. Bubbles is making probes consistently. So he has a very slight economy lead right now, but there hasn't been very much action in the match so far. Basically, we're just kind of macroing up. What's really important to do in these stages here, when people are just macroing up and there aren't big fights and big trades and big harassment, is to think about the details of your progression. Look at your money as this is happening. If you're floating money, think about where that could be spent. These points often go very unnoticed in your games. They're not very emotionally salient when you're kind of building up your macro and there aren't any big fights happening. But a lot of matches are decided upon like the hiccups in this macroing stage. When neither player is attacking the other, they're both just building workers and tech. But some people will get supply blocked, and then they'll fall behind. Or maybe they'll float a bunch of larvae, or maybe they'll stop making probes for a while, or fail to move their chronoboost to the correct structure. So really focus on those moments. Like here, I'm floating a ton of money. I could just make more queens. If I made more queens from my bases, I could spread more creep, which would allow me to defend this 4th base more easily, which would allow me to creep like to the mid-map much more easily. So that's a pretty big mistake from me right here. That went unnoticed when I was playing the match. I wasn't really thinking very much about that. I was just trying not to die to timings. Okay, so Bubbles went for Phoenix. This is kind of an informational choice. Making 2 Phoenixes isn't a lethal move. It's something that denies me information. So he can kill this Overseer. He can kill this Overlord. I should be taking Overlord speed, but I failed to do so. So I'm going to lose quite a few Overlords, and I don't actually have vision of this 4th base location, which is a pretty big mistake. If Phoenixes enter the game and deny me some vision, I need to find an alternative way to get some vision. I have, let's look at units, I have 12 Lings in the game. These 12 Lings are not going to kill the Protoss at all. Like, Photon Overcharge. It's great. It's amazing. You could defend like 10 bases. So, 1 Ling here. 1 Ling here. 1 Ling at the main move-out lane. 1 Ling at a 5th base location. Maybe 1 Ling here. This is a potential lane. They could break these rocks and run through here with an army and then attack. So, making better use of your units to fill vision on the map. A really good thing to do is to look at your mini-map at a given point in the replay and think about what information you have based on what's happening in the game. So, Bubbles has gases at his 3rd base. What's my vision? I have no vision of a 3rd base, or the gases, which would really inform my decision making. If I knew that he had gases at a 3rd base, I could just drone this 4th base straight away, and then put a Ling here to see when he takes a 4th. So that was a really big mistake from me. That's kind of a quiet mistake. It's not a loud, glaring mistake like, oh, I just prematurely detonated all of my veins. I just didn't find out what I needed to in time. So here, dropped a changeling, got some information, but I'm pretty supply blocked right now. I can't really spend my money. And I have all this army here. So thinking about the army value put in the game, and what return you're getting on that army value. What do I have? I have 12 roaches, 12 lings. Bubbles has 1 void ray, 5 phoenix, a sentry, stalker, 2 adepts, and a zealot. So pretty small army. Let's look at active forces. Yeah, so with Roachling, they're very fast units. They should be running around and doing stuff. The Roachling can't actually do anything to Phoenix or Void Ray, so they don't need to be here. It's kind of silly of me to even have them here in the first place. They could just be poking at this front, like seeing what this army looks like. This is a very small force, but it could be, say, some Immortals, and that would tip me off that he went for Robo. There could be some army over here kind of poking at this base. So this is another pretty big mistake in my play, making a lot of army that wasn't getting to leverage its strength. So the strength of this is its speed. It's very fast, and if for some reason there's a huge army, the Roachling can run home basically unpunished. Losing a queen here. Remember before, I said when the minerals were floating I could have made another round of queens? If I had made that round of queens, I would have been able to defend this base without losing that queen. So another principle that's really useful to kind of put in your mind is early mistakes compound later. I'll actually put that in the notes. That's a super important principle that you should really put in front of you. In the analysis section, let's do early mistakes compound later. So if you make mistakes in the early game, that will weaken your mid game. If you make mistakes in the mid game, that will weaken your late game. So be very, very aware of how those mistakes are scaling throughout the match and how to reduce the frequency of your early game errors to increase your strength in the mid game, just in general. You'll have more workers, more creep, more stuff. Alright, so let's look at units tab. At this stage, Bubbles has many more workers than me, and I don't actually know that. If I had vision of this 4th base, I would see a bunch of probes rallied. Do I have Overlord speed? Let's look at upgrades. I do have Overlord speed. So this Overseer is coming in. Thinking about scouting. So Day9 put it pretty well. Scouting is less about knowing exactly what the opponent is doing, and more about ruling out possibilities. The thing with Protoss is they could always proxy tech on the map. Zuri can also do this with Overlord Creep Drop and Aspire or whatever. So they could have a Pylon and a Dark Shrine here. So this Overseer is not necessarily going to see everything in the game. The main thing that you can look for is the economy size of the opponent. So you go in for a scout, you see full saturation at this base with 2 gases. You can see where the Chrono Boost is being spent. You can see the infrastructure. So with Stargates, you can see what units are being built from that. Basically full saturation here, relative to how it's been mined out, and full saturation at this base, and then full saturation at this base. You can play in a couple different ways. You can play lower economy than your opponent, hyper aggressive, kind of always at their front door attacking them and trying to probe for weakness. Another method is taking an economy lead, and if you see that an opponent is being very, very economical, you can be even more economical. So rather than attack into a base, you could take a base as a response. So I should have taken a base earlier. Cool. Energy is another really crucial aspect. So these queens in the game, you can be very, very critical if you want to be focused on the details of how the queens are spending their energy. The energy float isn't too big of a deal if you're making lots and lots of queens, but as a general rule, it's good to have at least 1 queen per hatchery, injecting consistently. I did a Nidus play. So this is a moment where the attention is being drawn to a very clear point in the game. This is an event. Boom. Lurkers have been Nidus into the Protoss main. Damage is being dealt. Bubbles. Let's see where he's looking. Bubbles camera. Bringing an observer and stalkers to these lurkers. Cool. I've directed the opponent's attention to this place, but this won't win the game outright. He'll eventually have the tools to clean this up. So a point that was identified to me by a coach is, at this moment, I've created a really great opportunity to kill this base, but I don't do that because my attention is here as well. So thinking about using two prongs as often as you can. A direct force like your main army, and then an indirect form of pressure. So these lurkers are kind of like my extraordinary force, my indirect pressure that's directing the attention of the opponent, but not killing them outright. It is causing them to divide their forces though, which creates an opportunity for me to kill this base here with my army. It would be pretty easy with just the Roachling Hydra. I probably wouldn't even need the queens to kill this base, but I failed to capitalize on that opportunity here. And so that's another mistake. Another thing you can be critical of as well is thinking about your creep and the value of each tumor cycle. So this creep tumor is kind of just hanging out. It's not making progress. This queen is just hanging out. An area of improvement would be to kind of do the Lurkernitis, do the attack, and do the creep, kind of in waves. At this stage of the game, Bubbles has effectively reached a critical mass of carrier, coupled with some disruptors, a Void Ray, 20 Adepts, and a Mortal. Composition is something you should be very mindful of. The more a player invests in a particular unit, the more exploitable their composition becomes. Any given unit in StarCraft has some respective counter units. So if you make all the same unit, like say all carrier, the opponent could go maybe Mass Corruptor or Queen Hydra. But if some disruptors are added in, you make Queen Hydra much more kind of dangerous and risky, and they can't just bunch up and all DPS together. So by virtue of Bubbles getting the economy lead, he was able to tech into a variety of things to make a more well-rounded composition. Now what do you do if your opponent has a well-rounded composition? You make your own well-rounded composition, and then try to take better engagements by micro. A key aspect of engagements is thinking about the attention of the opponent. If both players get to focus their entire attention on the engagement, they can get pretty good micro in. If you give them some point of pressure, like say the Lurkernitis or a Lurker drop, or even a Lane drop, something pretty cheap, you can engage with their army, and there will be a delay between the time that they go and address the extraordinary force and the time that they go and address the main army. This applies to every matchup on every map. Thinking about how you can direct your opponent's attention to increase your success in the main fight. Excellent. Another thing to touch on would be GG timing, knowing when to tap out of a given match. Some people kind of like to tap out as soon as something goes wrong and they're off their plan. I kind of favor staying in the match as long as it's useful for practice. So say someone dealt a lot of worker kills of damage with some early adepts. Say they killed 20 workers. You can stay in the game and keep fighting and try and remake those workers and tech up and then defend their next attack, try and hit your scout timing, and it can still be useful for you even if your likelihood of success is low. Also remember that the player who is ahead is not entitled to the victory screen. They won't necessarily make it to victory. They could still make some really crucial errors and get back to an even position or even fall behind. So we talked about statistics. Across our career, we have access to a great host of information pertinent to our progress, attend to what is useful, and look past what is useless. We talked about ladder points and how that basically doesn't help you in any way. It only stresses you out when you lose a lot of points. The graphs, workers active, and army value, we addressed that. Performance. So the performance screen gives you some useful pieces of information, but usually you want to be comparing that to your averages. And then let's talk about win rates. This is one of the few stats that's actually useful in the ladder section. So you have your career summary, that's the leagues you've been in, but ladders, statistics, this is pretty cool. So I think my webcam might be in the way of my actual win rates, but for any of these, this is a good point to kind of think about where to put in work in your custom games. You look at your matchups, and you say, alright, what is my worst matchup? Why is that my worst matchup? Who can I train with to improve that matchup? What builds or styles could I learn that would make me more successful in that matchup? And basically, you have your average win rate, which is around 50%. If you increase the win rate of your worst matchup, your overall win rate will increase until you get to higher MMR, and then it'll kind of even out to 50% again. So, on the ladder, be very okay with 50% win rate. The more games you play, the closer you'll get to 50%, unless you're at the very bottom of the ladder or at the top. Another thing to consider is the map report. So your win rates on the maps kind of indicate how successful your strategies are. If you go for the same strategy on every single map per your matchups, you'll kind of see where that strategy is more successful or less successful. So for me, why is Ulrina my lowest percentage win rate? Ulrina is a very extreme map. The rush distance is incredibly short. You're only a few steps away from fighting your opponent immediately. So emphasizing upgrades is usually very, very poor. Usually, you want to represent some pretty big army pretty fast, so you can be surviving and potentially defeating the opponent really quickly. Prion Terraces has 2 gold bases, which make the map kind of tricky, because you can either try and go for the gold bases and get a big economy lead, which exposes you to really early cheese, or you can try and play it safe and potentially fall behind someone who takes a gold base. So I haven't really figured out this map terribly well. Dusk Towers and beyond, I'm kind of above 55% win rate, so mainly, if I was doing custom games with players, I would try and emphasize my lower win rate maps, just to increase how familiar I am with the map flow and how the games tend to play out. Sessions. Each segment of time dedicated to the path of mastery in RTS is an opportunity for expression and refinement of our repertoire. Be patient with your warm-up, steady through the grind, and compassionate in your conclusion. So, I like to think of a given StarCraft player's repertoire kind of like a musician. A musician will have their main pieces that they've practiced the most, and when they play those, it'll be the most polished, the most crisp, and it'll sound the best. For us, we have builds and styles that we've practiced, and the ones we practice the most are the most smooth in our execution. So being deliberate about, I'm learning this style now, and then you practice that for a while, and then maybe you add another style on, and as you gain more and more experience, you can learn more and more styles, and continue to polish the ones that you've already kind of captured the main idea of. So being patient with your warm-up. When you start your session, the first game is usually the worst, just because you're kind of getting back into it. You're not quite acclimated to the aggression of the ladder. Like when I wake up in the morning and I log in for the first game, I'm kind of like chill and still waking up and I'm just building workers, and then suddenly there's like a Lingbane attack and I'm dead. I'm like, okay. At the end of my first game, if I lose, I always say good morning. It's kind of a way of forgiving myself for being groggy and not fully alert, like greeting the opponent and kind of acknowledging that it's my first game. And then you can move on to the next game, kind of bearing in mind that the ladder is a very dangerous place. Being steady through the grind is a way of kind of calming yourself and seeing the longer path. Improving at StarCraft requires immense game volume, like lots of matches, to really get a sense of what's going on and really practice your mechanics. So see that, and don't be too worried about any given match in particular. It's a long road. Focus on the details that are useful to you, but don't get too hung up. Don't get too bitter at certain opponents. Maybe they did a cheesy build. Figure out that build. Maybe they were bad mannered to you. Fuck them, whatever. It's fine. Be responsible for your own conduct. You don't need to worry about them. So, expectations in your sessions. You can't necessarily expect to have an upswing in any given session. Some sessions will be winning, some sessions will be losing, some sessions will be about break even, where you win about as much as you lose. So don't really expect any of those. Just be ready for whatever it's going to be. Creating deliberate emphasis. Scout timing, spending, worker production. So my current stream title on my channel is Place a Ling outside the opponent's base. I lost so many games just droning, teching, and then suddenly there's an army and I die without any prior indication. The Zergling is the fastest unit in the game, and I have no excuse for not having at least one Zergling outside the opponent's base to know when their army moves out and kind of what the army looks like. So that's been my deliberate emphasis, but your deliberate emphasis should be pertinent to what you're working on. So maybe your gas timing is just late consistently. When you're playing your games, create that emphasis, and then anytime you meet that goal, you can feel rewarded, like you're making progress. Maybe you have trouble spending your gas. So anytime you're in your games, say you get 100 gas, you want to go for Ling speed. Boom. Try and take it immediately. You've just succeeded in your emphasis. Good job. Even if you lose the game, you can feel like you're making progress. Identifying relative personal performance, A, B, and C game. This is a concept that I talk about a lot that most people don't really consider in the gaming scene. People like to identify as themselves when they're playing their best. They're like, yeah, like I'm rocking it, I'm playing my A game, that's me. Your C game would be the 15% worst of your personal performance. No one likes to play C game. It's not as fun, you lose more games, you get supply blocked more often, it's harder to spend your money, you forget to scout, it's just generally messy. And a lot of players, when they play C game, they'll say, oh yeah, I don't know what was going on, that wasn't me. No, it's you. It's you. And when I play C game, it's me. And if we can take ownership of the mistakes we make on C game, that will identify the least practiced parts of our training. C game kind of causes you to make mistakes you don't normally make on B and A game. But those are kind of like the trouble spots underneath the surface of those games. And you can still put in work. So maybe you make some C game mistakes like, I forgot to do my 4-minute Overlord Scout, or I forgot to hallucinate a Phoenix Scout whenever I'm on C game. Make that your emphasis for some of your ladder sessions. And if you identify that, like my games today are pretty poor, I'm on C game, go to those emphasis, like really simple stuff. I'm going to try and make supply on time so I don't get supply block. I'm going to try and hit my Overlord Scout timing. I'm going to try and keep a Ling outside their base. And that ties into making gains through losses in the notes. So even when you lose games, you gain game knowledge, you gain experience, you gain practice in working on your mechanics and building stuff and scouting. And you gain exercise for your brain. And then enjoying victories. It's amazing to outplay someone, outthink them, outmaneuver them. It's fantastic. But a lot of people have trouble enjoying a win because they'll feel like, it was still kind of messy for me, like I wasn't really happy with it. No, like, have fun. Have fun with the game. Don't be afraid to have a good time. Like, credit to Avalo, like, how many times has he punched his chair? That's great. Like, really enjoy it. If you get promoted, jump up and down, go, like, sing a song, whatever you need to do. Just enjoy your victories. You don't need to lord that over the opponent, though. Like, sometimes people turn that nasty, and they'll be, like, manner muling, and they'll be saying, get out, like, you're shit, like, I owned you. That doesn't help them, and it kind of distracts from your progress, but enjoy them in a responsible and respectful way. Analysis. Every match completed has its strengths and weaknesses laid bare in the replay. Many mistakes go unnoticed during the performance itself, but errors become visible when full attention is devoted to finding them. So, when you're playing a game, you're also occupied with all the mechanics, you're trying to do everything, execute everything correctly. But when you're in the replay, you can pause, and you can just look at everything as though you were a map hacker. You can see what the opponent is doing. You can see what the opponent is looking at. You can see what you're doing. You can see all your macro hiccups. You can consider maybe what you didn't see, maybe where you should have scouted. So really diving into those replays in a way that allows you to see details that you missed when you were in the live performance. As we spoke about in the replay, emphasizing identifying early errors as being prioritized above looking at the engagements kind of in the mid and late game, often, like we saw in the army value graph, one player just builds way more stuff. So for those replays, mainly you want to look at, well, how and why did they build more stuff? And where did I fall behind? What could I have done differently to build a similar amount of stuff or even more stuff than them? Production and spending in the analysis. Really paying attention to any time you have a structure in the game that's not working. Time is money. If you build something in the game, whether it's a forge, engineering bay, evolution chamber, like the energy of your town hall structures, it should be doing stuff. Like you employ people, they need to be putting in work. Like be a pretty cruel taskmaster with your swarm or your Protoss or your Terran. People should be doing stuff. You don't just want a bunch of SCVs like hanging out in a command center like sipping Kool-Aid. It's not helping you win the game. Composition, we spoke about a little bit in the replay as well. Thinking about creating a composition which does well against the opponent composition or is just generally well-rounded and strong. Vision, thinking about how much of the minimap you can see at a given time in terms of the vision you've filled. So maybe Overlord spread, if your Protoss having DTs at some of the new bases is a really good way of getting vision and having some observers patrolling on the map. Oracles are also a really good vision tool for Protoss. So basically for every race, you should have some plan for how you're going to be obtaining vision throughout the match. If you're